Ladies and gentlemen, I want to say one quick thing before we get started. We're about to start in about 1 minute, but we had an unforeseen error with the ordering of the books. We're still selling books tonight outside. You'll see a representative from Brazos Bookstore outside. We're still selling the books tonight, and Brazos has agreed if you leave your, with your payment, leave your mailing information, they will bear the expense of directly and expressly mailing them to you. We've also got some Baker Institute cards for Dr. Coleman to sign that you can put into the book. So we're still selling the books this evening. See a representative outside. Dr. Coleman, after the lecture, will also be signing any personal notes that you can put in there, and you'll receive it in the mail within a matter of a couple days from the bookstore. So I want to make sure everyone knows that we are still selling the books, and we'll have a couple of samples so you can see exactly what the book is. And our event staff will be available after the lecture if you have any questions on how to do that.
Good evening. I'm Alan Matisow. I'm the Associate Director of the Baker Institute, and I'm very pleased to welcome everybody here tonight. This event is actually made possible by the Kelly Day Endowment on the Status of Women in the Middle East. Kelly Day is a supporter of the Baker Institute, lives in Los Angeles, usually comes to these events, but was unable to do it this time. And I'd just like to express the gratitude of the Baker Institute to Kelly Day and the other donors of this endowment who make this occasion possible. The endowment actually has two purposes. One of them is to support research. And currently, it is supporting the work of Professor Al-Gamal, who is the Will Clayton Fellow at the Baker Institute and also chair of the Economics Department. He's spent a year at the International Monetary Fund. He's been with the Treasury, and he's interested in development issues in the Middle East. And he's running a most fascinating project, which is how to assist poor farmers in Egypt who are beyond the reach of the institutions that count, who need help, need credit, and so they're running a microfinance project that's a little different from the norm because the people who borrow will not be individuals, but it'll be community-based credit institutions, cooperatives, drawing on the strength of the relations of the families to self-sustain it and to make it work. And the results so far of the research are really quite promising. This is entirely within the spirit of the Kelly Day Endowment, and it also illustrates, I think, the motto of the Baker Institute, which is to build a bridge between ideas, the world of ideas, and the world of action. And the other thing that the Kelly Day Endowment does is educate. We bring to the university and we bring to this podium people who have important things to say about the issue that Kelly Day is interested in, which is women in the Middle East. And since we began this endowment in 2007, we've had a number of seminars, symposium events. We've had Sheikh Moza from Qatar. We've had Sahan Sadat, a remarkable woman who was the wife of the president of Egypt. And today, we have Dr. Isobel Coleman. Dr. Coleman has had an interesting career. She graduated from Princeton. She got her PhD in Oxford International Relations. She spent a year or so as a fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations, and then she did an interesting thing. She was recruited by McKinsey & Company, a famous consulting firm that some of us may know about, and spent 8 years there, became a partner, left that in 2000, became a CEO of a health service organization, and then in 2002, she went back to the Council of Foreign Relations. And there, she is a senior fellow, and she's the director of the Council's Women and Foreign Policy Program. She has written books, including in 2006, Strategic Foreign Assistance, Civil Society and International Security, and in 2008, Restoring the Balance, a Middle East Strategy for the New President. She's here today because of a book she wrote, and it has been published this year, called Paradise Beneath Her Feet: How Women Are Transforming the Middle East. Now, it's true that we don't have many books out there to buy, but this is a book worth buying. It's a very interesting book and very accessible. It argues that the secularizing elites that tried to modernize the Middle East and South Asia failed, and they've been pretty much washed away by the Islamic revival. And the debate that counts now is not the debate between secularists and Islam. The debate is within Islam itself, between the conservatives, the fundamentalists, who look to the 7th century as the golden age, and those who want to make an Islam, adapt an Islam to modern realities. And within that debate, the most interesting part of it is the debate about the role of women in Islamic societies. Dr. Coleman is interested in particular in Islamic feminism, and this book is about her adventures in the Middle East and what she's learned about this. And it's a fascinating book because it tells you about the countries that she knows about, tells you something about Islam, and most of all, it tells you about the fascinating women, often heroic women, who constitute this movement within Islam, drawing on the Islamic tradition itself to legitimize equal rights. And her point is not only that this is essential for justice, but that it is essential for the economic development of the region. She will, I'm sure, elaborate on her own book. She is going to talk to us today about women, Islam, and reform in the Middle East. We're very grateful, Dr. Coleman, that you came to talk to us today, and I hope that you'll give her a nice welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Alan, for that nice introduction. I feel like I can go straight to Q&A at this point because you've given such a good overview. I thought actually I would start out by telling you how I came to write this book, because as you heard from my background, I have a varied background. I did work for McKinsey for a number of years. I worked with financial institutions, so my PhD was in economic development and political economy. And at the Council on Foreign Relations for the last nearly decade, I have focused on the Middle East. And in my travels throughout the Middle East over the years, working on economic issues, working on political development issues, I kept coming back to the role of women in society. Of course, a lot has been written about the role of women from a human rights perspective, from a justice perspective, particularly in the Middle East, where there are some very human rights transgressions that occur with respect to women. But my interest was much more from an economic angle, because, as Alan alluded to, the fact is that if you underinvest in half your population, it's very difficult to achieve economic success in today's world. And the Middle East is a part of the world. Actually, there are 3 parts of the world: Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, which have, relative to other parts of the world, underinvested in the female half of their population. So there have been persistent gender gaps that have affected those 3 parts of the world. Now, in 1945, if you looked at the status of women around the world, Latin America, East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, they all looked pretty much the same on a variety of different statistics. Women's fertility, women's access to education, women's employment outside the home, women's political participation, even very basic statistics like life expectancy and female access to health care and nutrition, caloric intake, was very similar between a country like Korea and Japan and Egypt and Brazil. So you had very similar statistics. But what we know is that countries in Latin America and East Asia dramatically, significantly closed their gender gaps, enrolled women in school at the same rates as men, and opened up parts of the economy, and in fact, enjoyed enormous economic growth in many respects because of the empowerment of women. In 3 parts of the world, Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, South Asia, women have lagged. Now, when I look at the Middle East and South Asia, so my book is called Paradise Beneath Her Feet, How Women Are Transforming the Middle East. It's a little bit of a handful to say Middle East and South Asia, but I include Afghanistan and Pakistan in my book. So think of it as the broader Middle East. When I look at that part of the world in particular, the challenges for improving the status of women are significant. They are similar to what women have experienced around the world. You're up against very deep-seated culture, patriarchy, tradition. But in the Middle East and South Asia, you're also up against something else, which is the rise of a political Islam, which in recent decades in particular has equated women's rights with a number of bad isms: Westernism, feminism, materialism, neocolonialism, colonialism, and in the case of Afghanistan, communism. So you've had an equation of women's rights with a lot of things that are viewed very negatively in that part of the world. And so the challenge for women and women's groups is not only the challenges that women have faced in other parts of the world, but they're also up against being seen as going against the religion of the country, the religion of the culture. They are often labeled as being anti-Islamic. And so while you have had different women's groups that have pursued women's rights through a secular agenda, appealing to universal human rights, their reach has been limited. Now, in recent decades, what I have seen are a new generation of women who are approaching it from a different angle. They are trying to work from within an Islamic perspective. In some respects, these women are approaching it from a position of faith. They are part of the growing religiosity of the region. And they're saying, we want to be good Muslims, we want our religion, but we also want a modern role for ourselves in the world today. So you have women approaching it from a position of faith. You have other groups, other women approaching it from a much more tactical perspective. They say, we're secularists at heart. We wish it were not so, but our countries have become much more conservative, in some cases theocratic. And the reality is that if we ignore religion, we do so at our own peril. We lose ground. We cede that ground to the most conservative religious voices in society. So instead of doing that, we're actually going to adopt religious arguments. As much as we don't even want to do so, we are going to do so as a tactic to promote greater rights for women. And so you've seen it across the region, whether it's in a country like Morocco, where you've had secular women and women of faith come together to actually promote some pretty significant legal changes for women. Or in a country like Indonesia, where you've had women becoming much more educated themselves about Islam and Islamic texts, and arguing for more progressive interpretations of Islam to be taught even at the school level, having a big influence on curriculum to make sure that young women and men are taught in a way that is conducive to more gender equality in society. So you've seen different women's actions across the region. What is driving some of these changes? There are 3 things that I focus on in the book. One is rising levels of female education. So as I said, this is a part of the world that is underinvested in half of its population, but that is beginning to change slowly. You now have closing of gender gaps in the primary school and secondary school level in many countries across the region. Egypt, for example, now has equal numbers of boys and girls in school at the primary level. And in fact, and Jordan does too, there's Syria, there are a number of countries, Iran, Saudi. But what you're beginning to see is a trend across the Middle East that is true in OECD countries, that women are beginning to outnumber men at the secondary school level and at the tertiary level, at the university level. So in the United States, 55% of college graduates today are women. In some European countries, it's more like 60%. This is a trend that's happening in the Middle East. In Iran, in recent years, in the past decade, 70% of college graduates have been women. In Saudi, 63% of college graduates are women. Now, this is not a revolution in the making overnight. These things take a long time to work their way through and have impact. And people say to me sometimes, oh, well, these women in a country like Saudi, they go to all-female colleges, and when they graduate, they can't get a job. What type of change is that? And I say, well, think about our own country in the 1950s. Many women went to all-women colleges, and when they got out of college, a lot of their job prospects were quite constrained. You know, there were women who did lots of interesting work, but the majority of women were channeled into 3 professions: nursing, teaching, and secretarial work. And, you know, what you're seeing in the Middle East, I think, is the beginning of a pretty broad demographic shift, where you have more and more of your very educated human capital just now beginning to be female. Actually, Harvard Business School did a very interesting case study just recently looking at multinational companies and their ability to expand in the Middle East, arguing that because women are beginning to make up so much of the really advanced human capital in the region, that foreign multinational companies must look at hiring women and really integrating women into their workforce if they want to have a competitive edge. So you're beginning to see more women achieving higher levels of education. And this is across the board. One of the other things that you're seeing is women becoming more religiously literate. We find it very threatening when we hear about the rising levels of religiosity and piety in the region. And we also find it, I know many people, disturbing that women are part of this trend. But it is a trend across the region, and women are very much a part of it. And what you find is that women are engaged more and more in Quranic study groups, where they actually read the Quran as part of a formal study group, either with friends or even affiliated with some type of official institution, a mosque or a university. And one of the things that you find happening is that women are reading the Quran for themselves in a very different way than men read it. And they're beginning to question the mainstream interpretations, because sometimes those mainstream interpretations are quite different from what's actually written in the Quran. And you find that women are becoming more religiously literate in many different countries. And that's happening. And you find them having a perspective that is challenging. Now, the second factor that's helping to change the landscape is the role of media. In the last decade, you've seen a huge opening of media in the Middle East. I'm sure you've read about the rise of Al Jazeera. You know, that's just the tip of the iceberg. You have lots of different television channels like Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, satellite cable television, all different formats that have taken the region by storm. And women are very much a part of it. So you have formats in the Middle East that would be familiar to many in this country who watch shows like The View. In the Middle East, there's an Arabic version of The View, which is hugely popular. It's 4 women sitting around discussing typical issues that you would see on The View, everything from recipes to decorating, but they also get into very sensitive social subjects: domestic abuse, sexual violence, polygamy, why women cannot drive in Saudi Arabia. They bring scholars on the show. Where in the Quran does it say that women can't drive a car? They ask the scholars, who then look all uncomfortable because they know what the answer is. They bring scholars on the show to debate each other about why women can't vote. Can women be leaders? All sorts of different issues. They talk about subjects that up until a few years ago were really taboo: rape, incest, domestic abuse, domestic violence. And it's 43% of the viewers are men. This is a window onto women's world that men have formerly been quite excluded from. And it's also a way of bringing debate about these subjects into people's living rooms in a very unprecedented fashion. There are other aspects of the media. The fact that women are so much a part now of the production of media. The news show hosts, the talk show hosts, the news anchors, so many of them are women in all of these countries. I was just in Pakistan 2 weeks ago. All of the women, all of the anchors today, well, many of them are women. And it's showing women in a different light. It's one of those elements of popular culture that's beginning to change the way people view the role of women in society. Soap operas. Soap operas are hugely popular across the region. And in the Arab world, one of the most popular soap operas today come out of Turkey. These soap operas are Turkish soap operas, dubbed into Arabic, and people are obsessed with them. They watch them all the time. And the characters are very breaking down cultural stereotypes. You have in one of these Turkish soap operas, the husband is very respectful and loving towards his wife. One wife, only one wife. He includes her in family decision making. She works outside the home. She wears a headscarf, but she works outside the home, and she's very much a part of the decision making of the family. And in the Arab world, it's interesting because now one of the most popular names in the Arab world is this Turkish man's name. They all say they want to marry a Turkish guy like this soap opera star. In Afghanistan, soap operas have become hugely popular, and it shows women living a life that's a modern, conservative, religious still, but very modern, working outside the home, involved in decision making, controlling income, all sorts of things that really spark lots of debate. Other shows, I know here as part of the Kelly Day Endowment, you had Amr Khalid speak here some years ago. Amr Khalid is a very popular Muslim televangelist. He does urge women to wear the headscarf. But beyond that, he is as progressive as it comes when it's with regard to women and women's rights. He encourages women to go to university, to own their own businesses, to be active economically, to be active politically. It's a very different message than the conservative fundamentalist message. In Afghanistan, you have a show like Afghan Star, which is modeled after American Idol. And it shows young Afghan women performing, not in a Western American sense, but in an Afghan sense, and having a huge following in the country, in the popular media. Again, breaking down stereotypes. Even in a country like Saudi, there's a Saudi version of American Idol. Very different than what you would expect here. They have people come on and recite poetry. Earlier this year, a woman came on the show, fully covered in her black chador, just slits for her eyes showing. She came on the show and in her sing-song voice said her poem, which went something like this: "You clerics, you are destroying our religion. You are issuing fatwas that go against the true nature of Islam. You are saying things against women which have no basis in religion, and you are bad for our country and bad for Islam around the world. And people were stunned. The judges passed her on to the next round. They loved her. Now, just as Alan said, I think this has much more to do, less to do about us versus them, and much more to do about within these societies. The judges who passed this woman on to the next round were threatened with death threats. But it didn't stop them from passing her to the next round. And it initiated a conversation in that country around what is an appropriate role for women. And it's not the only conversation. There are lots of conversations going on about this, and women are very much part of that. You know, in my Saudi chapter, I describe a woman who became the first head of a Saudi, first bureau chief of a Saudi daily. And this is a woman from a very middle-class, conservative, traditional Saudi family. Born in Mecca, she wears the niqab, which by Saudi standards is even conservative. And she is part of this new generation of women who are determined to look at a whole range of issues in their society that formerly have not been discussed publicly about the role of women. And when I asked her what motivated her to go into journalism, she referred back to a very traumatic event in Saudi's recent past that occurred in 2002. There was a fire in a girls' school in Mecca, her hometown. A fire broke out when some of the girls were smoking and they dropped their cigarettes in the stairwell. And the school caught on fire, smoke filled the hallways. The girls, as you would imagine, rushed out of the burning building. The mutawa, the religious police, were on the street, and the girls, in their haste, had forgotten their abayas. And the religious police forced them back into the school, and many of them died. And this event came not even a year after 9/11. Now, 9/11, of course, was a traumatic event here in this country. It was also a traumatic event in Saudi, where 16 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi, and many Saudis didn't want to believe that. And they publicly denied it. Very senior Saudis, Prince Nayef, the king's brother, even publicly denied that Saudis could have been involved. But they knew that Saudis were involved, and they knew deep down that something had gone terribly wrong in their society. And after this fire in the girls' school in Mecca, it unleashed a tidal wave of introspection with a lot of public soul-searching about how could our religion have become so conservative and narrow that men would push girls back into a burning building simply to get their headscarves. And this was an incident that really inspired this woman, Sabria Jawar, that I write about in my book, to become a journalist. And it also coincided with a period of some opening in that country, that as a result of 9/11 and the girls' fire, and also the terrorism that impacted Saudi too in 2003, 2004, they have made some modest openings in that country, and women are plowing right through them. And Sabria is one of them. And she became, as I said, the first bureau chief, and is writing about issues that only women can write about in Saudi, because after all, it's a gender-segregated society. Men can't even talk to women, and so it takes women to write about other women. We were talking about KAUST, Ambassador Jazarian and I, before, and about this new university, King Abdullah University for Science and Technology. It is a university that the king is building. It's opened. I went there earlier this year to see it. Dedicated to science and technology and improving science and technology in the Saudi kingdom. And it is a co-educational university. Men and women are both enrolled. And not without controversy. You know, there were some senior clerics who came out and announced this mixing of the sexes was against Islam. And in fact, one of them issued a fatwa saying that it was against Islam and those who promote it were undermining the religion. Well, who's promoting it? Who put his name on it? The king. What did the king do? He fired him. He then had a group of other clerics to look at the issue, and they toiled away and came out and made an announcement that, in fact, the mixing was not at all against Islam, and issued some other statements to the effect that it is an obligation of women to be educated. Now, this is a battle that's not over, believe me. But I think that in a country like Saudi, where the largest construction project right now in the Middle East is a new university for women, Princess Noor University outside of Riyadh, for 40,000 women. It's got its own monorail system. This is a genie that can't be put back in the bottle. When the Saudis first started girls' education, it goes back to 1962. King Faisal at the time came to the United States in search of a large arms deal from President Kennedy. And Kennedy said to him, Faisal, I have a problem. My Congress really doesn't like you, doesn't want to sell you arms. So you need to cut me some slack. You need to do two things for me. One is I'd like you to abolish slavery, which was widespread in the kingdom, 1962. The other thing, and the king himself owned over 100 slaves. The other thing I want you to do is to allow girls to go to school. And Faisal said, oh, the slavery one, that's easy, we can do that. But the girls going to school, that's going to be much harder. And not from his own perspective, the king was actually relatively forward-looking on those types of issues. But he understood that his clerics would have a hard time with it. And indeed they did. And they argued strenuously against it and said that girls going to school would be putting girls on a slippery slope. That it would be a slippery slope to who knows what. And they were right. Today, 63% of college graduates are women. You have women now moving into all different aspects of the Saudi economy. One of the people I profile in my book, Dr. Haifa Jalal Al-Lail, is the dean of Efat University. And she has started a whole computer science and technology program at her women's university. And some of the people, supporters of her, said, Haifa, we like what you're doing, but don't call it engineering. Don't call it computer science. It's too inflammatory. No one's going to hire a woman engineer anyway. And she said, well, I think I am going to call it engineering and computer science because that's what it is. And I think you're wrong. I think they are going to hire them. And a couple of years ago, I was in Dubai, and I happened to be talking to a partner at one of the big consulting firms there. You can guess which one it was. And I said to him, do you ever hire Saudis? And he said, no. Well, we never hire Saudis. There's nobody in Saudi who's taught to think for themselves. Nobody who's taught any type of critical thinking skills. And then he hesitated and said, well, except for those young women coming out of Efat University. He said, now that's very innovative education. It's real liberal arts, critical thinking that they're being taught. We haven't hired any of them yet, but we're keeping a close eye on them because they have real potential. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And when I played this back to one of the deans at Efat, she said, oh yeah, that doesn't surprise me. It's really sad, she said. It's the men who are really getting left behind because they're not being taught how to think in our country. In the book, I look at 5 different countries: Saudi, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. And the countries are all so different. Some of them are rich, some of them are desperately poor. Some of them are Sunni, some of them are Shia. Some of them are war-torn, some of them are at peace. I mean, they're really a real broad range of countries. But one thing that you're seeing is women in all of these countries networking with each other and networking with women from other countries to promote their agendas. Now, in Iran, you have a whole women's movement there that is arguably the most active women's movement in the region. and I'm sure you were well aware of it, seen the Green Movement a year and a half ago with those very courageous protesters on the street. So many of them were women. And the Iranian authorities are so nervous about the women's movement that they continue to lock any of these women leaders up because they really are threatened by the potential of the women's movement to promote change in that country. But one of the things that the women leaders did is they looked at the success that women in Morocco had. And I mentioned earlier that the women in Morocco were able to change the family law in that country, the Mudawana. And they reformed the Mudawana by a multi-pronged strategy. One element of this strategy was a grassroots-based campaign where they got signatures from people all over the country expressing their support for the set of changes that they were looking for. The other thing they did is they worked with the clerics in the country to bless the changes in effect. Because all along the women have been told, you can't have these changes. They go against the Sharia, this Islamic law. And the women said, well, we don't really believe that. There's an interpretation of Sharia out there which is compatible with the changes that we're seeking. And they worked with a number of clerics who said, indeed, you're right. There are certainly interpretations of Sharia that accommodate these changes. So they had a grassroots-based movement, they got important clerics to weigh in, and they also had the top-down support from the king. The success of the women's movement inspired women in Iran to follow a similar strategy. So they put together a grassroots-based campaign, and it's called the Million Signature Campaign. And they've now gotten hundreds of thousands of signatures, despite an incredibly repressive environment across the country. Signatures from every part of the country, from men and women alike. Ayatollah Khomeini's grandson is one of the signatures. They also have worked with clerics to bless the changes. And in Qom, the religious center, there are a number of clerics who actively support the women, issuing fatwas on their behalf, encouraging the changes, and promoting what they're looking for from a religious perspective. In fact, one of them is so progressive on the women's issues that the women actually refer to him as their women's mufti. And it's interesting because the same clerics who are supporting the women are increasingly at odds with the government, not just on women's rights, but on democracy, on the role of government in society, on all sorts of issues. But you're beginning to see it line up in quite an interesting way. The third thing I want to mention that is helping propel the women's movement, I talked about rising levels of education, I talked about the role of the media, and the third thing is the fear of extremism in these own societies, in their own cultures, that is enabling and encouraging leaders to be much more proactive on women's issues. Because what they increasingly understand is that extremist views on women go hand in hand with extremism. So in a country like Morocco, Morocco was racked by terrorism in 2003, 2004. And it was also very conscious of the fact that so many of the young men showing up to fight jihad in Iraq and being picked up on terrorist charges in Europe came out of Morocco. And they were very concerned, the king and other authorities were very concerned in Morocco about the growing extremism and terrorist threat in their own country. So one of the things that they did, not only in supporting the women and the women's movement for the changes in the reform of the laws, but they also initiated a program to begin to train women as religious leaders in the country, known as Vaize, Morshidat. They do everything the men can do except lead the Friday prayers. And they're very clear on why they're doing this. They don't publicly state it all the time, but in interviews in the newspaper and certainly in private interviews, they've come out and said, we're doing this as a way to combat extremism. We think that if we have women trained as preachers, that they are more likely to preach a moderate form of Islam. Other countries have followed suit. Turkey has a program like this. Egypt has a program like this. Qatar has a program like this. Even in Iran, they are training women as religious scholars. Now, in Iran, these women are pretty conservative voices right now. But over time, just by dint of being women religious leaders, they are challenging the fundamentalist notions of women in society. So you're seeing it from a number of different angles. The last thing I want to say is that when I'm asked by people, how did you find these women that you write about in your book? It must have been so hard to find them. And I say, no. The hard thing was choosing which women to write about, because there were so many of them. So many incredibly courageous women who are breaking down stereotypes, being a role model, and putting themselves out there, in many cases, in a very, very courageous way. And one of the women I write about in my book is Shukriya Barakzai. She's a parliamentarian in Afghanistan. She was a journalist and the head of a civil society organization. And she ran for parliament back in 2004. And as she loves to say, she ran in a different district than her husband, but she got more votes than he did. And he is a prominent businessman, and she also likes to tell people how much money he put into his campaign versus how much money she put into hers, and it was a tenfold difference. But she got elected, and she has been really an unswerving voice for women in Afghanistan. And she said to me, I was with her a couple years ago in Kabul, and she said to me, I know that I'm on the assassination list. I know that people would love to see me dead, and I'm ready to die for my country. I will not give up. And we'd just been talking about her 3 young daughters. And I said, Shukriya, what about your 3 young daughters? And she said, they'll know that their mother died to make theirs a better country. And across Afghanistan today, you see girls' schools being burned down, and you see parents rebuilding them. And you see women leaders be assassinated, and you see other women take their place. And I don't know what's going to happen in Afghanistan, but I can tell you that the Taliban will have a greater role in the country even than they do now. And some of the gains that women have achieved in that country in the last 8 years, and they have been significant. I've been going there, I've been there 7 or 8 times since 2001. And the changes are palpable, not only in Kabul, but in other parts of the country. And I do fear for the gains that women have made, but I also know that these women are indefatigable, and they will find a way to continue with their own progress. And I think that the drawdown of U.S. troops in that country will in some ways be to their benefit, because they're going to have to find ways to work within the society that they've got. And I write about some of these women in my book who are working in some of the most conservative areas of the country today, opening girls' schools, working with the local leaders at a community level to educate girls, to teach them about health, about reproductive health, to provide maternal care to them, and to provide business opportunities to women. And I don't think that these types of changes can come at the barrel of a gun. They're going to take an awfully long time in Afghanistan. You all saw the cover of Time magazine with the woman with her nose cut off, and the headline that said, "What happens when we leave?" Well, guess what? That happened with us there, with 120,000 troops in the country. And it wasn't some rabid Taliban guy who did that to her. It was her husband. And these changes are going to take an awfully long time, and they're going to go at different rates in different countries. Iran is by far the most progressive country in the region, by far. And when that government changes, women will emerge as regional leaders across the board. You know, the women in Saudi are highly educated, but it's the most conservative society that there is. And in Afghanistan, you're dealing with almost medieval statistics. In some places, 5% female literacy. It's going to take generations to change that. But change is happening at different rates. Some will be forward and a little backwards. But when you look at it over the longer period of time, you'll see that women are on a positive trajectory, and that in many ways they are leading and driving change across the region, which leaves me cautiously optimistic. Thank you.
Dr. Coleman says that she will take questions.
You draw a very positive picture of the Middle East. Do you suppose when you write your next book about Malaysia or Indonesia that you find the same answer?
Actually, you know, I do write about Malaysia and Indonesia in my book, and they both, all around, you've seen this rising Islamism across the region, and that's true in Malaysia and Indonesia too. But the women have made such gains in Malaysia and Indonesia that they're in many ways a bulwark against that rising fundamentalism. And I just received the Indonesian version of Forbes, and it had on the cover the 100 most important women in Indonesia. And I mean, the woman that I wrote about in my book was number 96 on the list, which just tells me there's, 95 other, women who I easily could have chosen from that country. But most of them are business women on the list who are running huge companies in that country. And I mean, that Indonesian Forbes really gives the American Forbes, women's issue a run for its money. That there are some truly remarkable women. And the other thing that they've done so successfully in Indonesia, and this is what I write about in my book, is really engage at a grassroots level, particularly in the pesantren, which are the religious schools that teach the young boys and girls. And the women are very influential at the pesantren level on curriculum. And that's what matters so much. So they're very careful at making sure that the curriculum is gender neutral is probably too strong a word, but that it portrays women in a positive light, that it has examples of women working, of being active, of interpretations that are favorable to women. And the other thing about Indonesia is it has one of the most remarkable records in family planning that goes back really to the 1950s. And that, again, is very much at a grassroots level.
What do you think about the stoning possibility? How do you see that happening?
The interesting thing about that is the reactions within Iran. I mean, people are horrified in Iran. And you have one of the active women's movements that I talk about in my book is a women's campaign called Stop Stoning Forever. And it's a very active campaign that argues on universal rights, but also on religious grounds, why stoning should be abolished from the penal code. And you have very senior clerics who support that campaign. So what will happen in that case? They have backed away from the stoning punishment, only to come back. There's clearly an internal dynamic there going on that, again, highlights this tension within that society over, I would say, the majority who find it barbaric and a minority who's pushing it for a whole variety of political, mainly, but also, religiously fundamentalist reasons. And where that will come out, my guess is she will not be stoned.
Right here.
How long did it take you to do the study before you wrote the book?
Well, the question is, how long did it take to do this research for this book? And the book incorporates almost a decade worth of research because I have been covering the Middle East for 9 years now, almost 10 years. I actually wrote the book. It took me about a little less than 2 years to write the book. But I drew upon a lot of experiences and travel to that part of the world, even when I wasn't explicitly working on the book.
So,
Somebody, Francois?
Yes. So I haven't read your book yet, but listening to you, I would like you to tell us really what are the conclusions that you draw from these research, these interviews, and so on. What is your main message, both to the American audience and to the Middle Eastern or Indonesian?
It's not a prescriptive book, so it doesn't have a list of, takeaways at the end. I think there are two messages, though. One is for the American or Western reader, which is that change has got to come from within. The second message is more to a Middle Eastern reader, which is that change is happening. It's in your best interest. Support it and take encouragement from others who are doing like-minded work and having some success in other countries. And the feedback I've gotten from women across the world, around the world, but across the Middle East, has been really inspiring to me. To say, I had no idea that this was going on, and it's inspired me to take action and to find hope in what I'm already doing. And the other thing that to me has been very heartening have been the reviews in the region of the book. The book has been very widely reviewed by all the major papers in the Middle East and in Pakistan. And in fact, there's now an Urdu version of the book in the works, and I think an Arabic version of the book too. So I'm very heartened by that, because I think it's I think a lot of men are really interested in the book, in addition to women too.
Sir.
The release of this woman in Burma by the military was mentioned in papers as almost equivalent to Mandela being released in South Africa. How do you feel that the Middle East women are reacting? Is there any reaction to what's happened there?
I don't think that that they're so inspired by that particular story. It's such a different context in many ways for them, and very far away, from them. One of the things that stirs up a lot of talk and debate in the Middle East is Iraq, and the relatively free elections that have happened in Iraq, and whether or not real democracy can emerge in that country. And I think people are skeptical whether it will or not, but also hopeful that Iraq could lead the region. Now, it's been through a lot of bloodshed. They don't want to repeat that in their own experience, and they're deeply mired in a political stalemate right now. But, every time I'm there, people want to look at Iraq and examine what's happening there as a potential model for political freedom in the Arab world.
Can you comment on the role of women in Palestine?
Well, I actually don't write about that at all in my book. It's an area that I guess in some ways I avoided, because I feel as if the women's issue there is subservient to so many other issues, or one other issue in particular. But much of what I write about is applicable to Palestine too. You've had a secular movement. The PLO and Fatah have been traditionally secular movements that have really been overtaken by fundamentalist movements. So Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and they have tried to impose a very conservative, fundamentalist view of women on Palestine that just simply doesn't fly. So they've tried to segregate schools in the public sphere. They've tried to prevent women from, working in different areas. They've also, threatened women who appear on television, that they're going to kill them if they are on television. So there's that very sort of severe extremist strain. And yet, Palestinian women are highly educated and play a very prominent role in society. So it's that fundamentalist viewpoint, they have failed to impose it on Palestinian women. And if anything, Palestinian women, I think, have pushed back on that, although Palestinian women are very much a part of the movement, and all that entails.
Turkey is one of the few countries that is secular. I'm originally from Turkey. Despite we've been secular since 1923, the participation of females in the labor market has been only 26%. Actually, it's gone backwards in the last number of years, and then it's going the other way now. More and more women are wearing the headscarf, and social pressure increasing to actually feel uncomfortable and wear the headscarf. If there was a message or a way that we could support the women there, what would that be? And is there any mention in your book, maybe as an example?
Well, again, Turkey is part of this rising conservative movement across the region, and you see it even in secular Turkey, which I don't think is secular anymore. And in some ways, yes. And the AKP denies being an Islamist party, but I refer to them as an Islamist party in my book. They're an Islamist party. But one of the interesting things, and undoubtedly one of the things that the AKP has promoted is women wearing the headscarf. And they have done it on grounds of freedom of expression and religious freedom, but there's enormous pressure on women to wear the headscarf. And Christian friends of mine in Turkey tell me that they come under pressure to wear the headscarf. So there's enormous social pressure to wear the headscarf. Beyond that, the AKP is very interesting when it comes to women. And you're right that there are rising levels now of women's economic participation. And that's partly driven by the AKP. So wearing the headscarf, they encourage women in all aspects of the economy. And you've seen the AKP really promote women business leaders and also women political leaders. So the AKP has a program to promote a third of the mayors across Turkey as women. And within the party, they have almost a quota system for women. And the other thing that the AKP has done is they've taken on some issues that secular governments haven't even touched in the past. One of them I write about in my book is honor killings. And the AKP has taken on this issue in a very forceful way, arguing that it's against Islam and it must be punished at all costs. And you've seen the incidence of honor killing, reported honor killings go up because it's now being reported on and enforced in the country. And you've seen some very strong laws passed against honor killings under the AKP. The other thing that the AKP initiated was a very interesting project called the Hadith Project. And in Islam, there's the Quran, which is supposedly the word of God transmitted through the mouth of Muhammad. Then you've got the Hadith, which are all the sayings and doings of Muhammad during his lifetime. And many of the very worst things relating to women in Islam come out of these Hadith. And some of these Hadith were not written down for hundreds of years after Muhammad lived. They were, miraculously, recovered from the dustbin of history hundreds of years after Muhammad lived. And they say, some of them are very pernicious towards women. And the AKP government started this whole project at Ankara University to reevaluate the Hadith. And it's a very interesting project, and it was reported on by the BBC and caused all sorts of controversy in the region. The Turks are rewriting the Quran, and the AKP, no, we're not doing anything of the sort. And they've really gone underground, and nobody will talk about it. But it's very interesting to me what they're trying to do, which is, you're absolutely right, it's a much more religious environment, and that's what's happened throughout the region. But I think I think they really are trying to find, an accommodation between religion and modernity in a way that other countries aren't even thinking about.
Anybody over here? Yes, back there.
In the beginning, you said that feminism has sort of been vilified and seen as a Western concept. And I was wondering if any of the women you've interviewed have identified with feminism, and if so, how their religion plays a role in that.
If the women identify with feminism?
Yes.
It depends what country they're from. So in a country like Saudi, to call yourself a feminist is deadly. Not really deadly, but very difficult. In Afghanistan, it's probably deadly. So they don't. Although some of them will tell you, oh yeah, I am a feminist. So they do identify that way privately, but not publicly. The place where they most publicly identify that way is Iran, where when I interview women and talk about Islamic feminism, they say to me, oh, that's so 1990s. We're so beyond that. We went through Islamic feminism. We made a lot of gains. We just want feminism now. We just want pure feminism. We're done with that whole Islam thing. We just want feminism. And that's what they will say. Now, again, not officially. One of the women I interview in my book, she's very much she was part of the regime, and now she's sort of gone. She was part of the Green Movement too. But, she would demur and say, oh, I don't like Islamic feminism. I like Muslim rights for women, this type of thing. So they none of them like the term Islamic feminism, but when they talk, what many of these women will say is that they identify with feminist principles. But they're very cagey about that term feminism because it really can be just a whole load of baggage that they want to avoid.
Yes.
Can you tell us anything about inheritance, about women inheriting from their husbands or their fathers?
Sure. The question is about inheritance. And inheritance is one of the most controversial issues is around family law. And the reason it's so controversial is because it affects everybody's life. So criminal law affects criminals, and most people in society are not criminals. Family law affects everybody. Everybody gets married, have children, custody issues, divorce, inheritance. These are very, very personal issues that affect lots and lots of people. The other thing is that there's a lot said in Islam about these issues. And so inheritance, the Quran is very clear. It says, women shall inherit half of what a man inherits. And so based on that, the Sharia in many countries gives women one share, one part, and boys 2 parts of the inheritance. Now, what the Islamic feminists argue, men and women alike, is that the spirit of the Quran was very progressive for women. In 7th century Arabia, to give women inheritance rights at all was revolutionary. And it wasn't well until the 20th century that women in most Western countries got inheritance rights. So if you go back and you look at the spirit of the Quran, it was very progressive for women. And the reason that women only got 1 share as opposed to 2 share for men is because they were not heads of households in 7th century Arabia. In 21st century, they are. And therefore, in the spirit of the original spirit of the Quran, they should inherit equally to men. And so there are, in some countries, that interpretation has taken hold, and the inheritance laws are equal for men and women. So it is interpreted that way in some countries, and in others it's not.
Yes.
Could you comment on, we hear a lot about madrasas and how conservative they are, and what kind of a countervailing kind of Islamist force are they in all of these countries for boys?
Okay, so the question is about madrasas, and a madrasa is a religious school.
Yeah.
And people say to me, oh, what about all those madrasas in Saudi? Well, there aren't madrasas in Saudi. All the schools teach religion in the curriculum. There are madrasas. I mean, the place where there are most madrasas is in Pakistan and also in Afghanistan. But madrasas are religious schools, and there are estimates that range from 10,000 to 30,000 on the number of madrasas in that country. There have been lots of studies done on madrasas, and I recommend the work of Christine Fair, who's a professor at Georgetown, and she's done some of the most interesting work on madrasas. But what her work shows is that while there's a small percentage of madrasas that teach some very, very bad stuff, the vast majority of madrasas, it's more a problem, less a problem of commission and more of omission. They simply don't teach anything useful other than rote memorization of the Quran. And so they have graduates come out prepared for little else other than to teach rote memorization of the Quran. And, how many mosque leaders do you need? So the problem is that it's just not a very effective curriculum. The other so what of her work is that when you look at the state schools, some of the attitudes that come out of the state schools are equally as alarming as what's coming out of the madrasas. So the madrasas themselves in general are not necessarily the problem, although there is a small group of madrasas that I suppose we could actually just call them terrorist factories in Pakistan. But in general, the bigger problem with the madrasas is that they're really just not equipped to do much. And there are organizations that are trying to work with madrasas to reform madrasas, in effect, to make them more worldly.
Yes, ma'am.
In the Timurid states in Uzbekistan, weren't the madrasas for scientific research also?
The question is, in Uzbekistan?
Yes, in the Timurid time in the 12th century.
Yeah, I mean,
They were very scientific. The logarithms were vetted in Timurid, so they're not just religious.
Well, today they mostly are. I mean, your classical madrasa did teach a range of subjects. They taught logic. They taught philosophy. They taught science and mathematics. But today, in Pakistan in particular, your madrasa is a warm meal and basic literacy through rote memorization of the Quran. That's basically what it is. And well, it's been perhaps maybe not intentionally, but in many cases it fills a gap, because the state has failed in its obligation to educate children. And I was just in Pakistan. This is a country that is spending upwards of 60% of its budget on the military and less than 2% on education. And that's Pakistan's basic problem, and it will never change with that dynamic in place. And then you have madrasas that fill the gap.
Next question back.
I'm from Iran, and I'm wondering if you traveled there, and if you did, have you interviewed women who are currently involved in the government because they happen to take on a more extremist view of Islam?
Some of them. Yeah, I have traveled there, and I spent a couple of weeks there doing research on my book. And some of the women in the government are mouthpieces for the government, and that's particularly true of this government. But, you know, Iran is a really interesting country. It's a fascinating country. And I think the Iran chapter in my book is the most interesting chapter. And the women in Iran who were the vanguard of the revolution, they were the daughters of the Ayatollahs, and they truly were the vanguard of the revolution in so many ways. And after Khomeini delivered this Islamic regime, they were sorely disappointed. And actually, one of the women I write about is Ayatollah Talagani's daughter. And she was a mouthpiece for the early revolution, and yet she became deeply disillusioned. And she said, you know, all that this regime has gotten us is poverty and polygamy. And she then went on, I mean, she's the daughter of one of the most famous grand Ayatollahs in Iran, and who was a real rival to Ayatollah Khomeini. And she went on to challenge the regime in so many ways, including, you know, this restriction on women not being able to run for president. So she put herself forward as a candidate and encouraged scores of other women to follow suit. And in recent elections, presidential elections, you've had as many as 100 women candidates running, just to prove a point that women can run. And in fact, in the last election, Ahmadinejad had to acknowledge, okay, women can run for election. Legally, they can. All of you are disqualified, but women can run for election. So, you know, Iran is such an interesting country, and so many of these women who started out as deeply conservative, you know, vanguards of the revolution, today, these same women are the ones marching in the streets.
The interesting thing is that almost all the questions you ask are answered in this book.
And so many more.
My advice is, on the way out, order one.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, she's going to, I'll take her. I'm going to get my car.